We picture Henry VIII as the king who could kill a wife on impulse. But the paper trail points to something colder. Before the Tower, there was paperwork, petitions, church courts, acts of parliament, treason charges, annulment rulings, warrants, and seals pressed into wax. A queen could lose her name. A marriage could be made to have never existed. A suspect accusation could be converted into high treason against the king himself. And at the end of the paper trail were real women, Catherine stripped of status, Anne condemned by formal trial, another Catherine destroyed by an act of parliament. Henry's power did not always ignore the law. It could make the law speak for him. So who built the machinery, and how did each wife pass through it? So the 6 marriages are not 6 separate scandals, they are 6 collisions with a system that kept finding new legal routes. Henry sat at the center. But institutions gave his will a public shape. Church courts could decide whether a marriage had ever been valid. Parliament could turn a private crisis into a statute binding the realm. The Privy Council could gather testimony, manage arrests, and steer the king's business behind closed doors. Treason law could make alleged betrayal inside the royal household an offence against the state. And in the darkest cases, attainder let Parliament condemn a named person by act, without the protections of an ordinary trial. Each wife entered that machinery from a different angle. Catherine of Aragon is not Anne Boleyn. Jane Seymour is not Catherine Howard. Anne of Cleves and Catherine Parr survived by different routes. There was no single formula. There was something more useful to power. Royal marriage had become national business. Once a queen's status threatened succession, religion, alliance, or Henry's authority, the machinery could be adjusted around her. Before Henry could bend it to his own marriages, he inherited an older system in which a king of England still had to look beyond England, toward Rome. The older system began with a fact Henry could not escape. In Tudor England, marriage was never only 2 people inside a palace. It was inheritance, diplomacy, sacrament, and a public promise about who would rule when the king was dead. Henry knew this from the start. His father, Henry VII, had won the crown after civil war, and the Tudor claim still carried the anxiety of something newly built. A stable succession was national security. Catherine of Aragon entered the marriage with Europe behind her. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, raised inside one of Europe's most powerful Catholic dynasties. Her marriage joined England to Spanish prestige, Catholic legitimacy, and continental politics. Removing her risked offending an imperial family, unsettling alliances, and questioning the legitimacy of any child born from the marriage. And there was a child, Mary, a royal daughter with a claim and a place in the line. But in Henry's England, many saw a daughter as a dangerous answer to the succession problem. A disputed heir could mean rival claimants, foreign husbands, noble factions, and a kingdom fractured around the throne. So when Henry argued that his marriage to Catherine had never been valid, he was trying to change the legal foundation under the next reign. The problem was church law. Questions about validity, dispensations, and annulments moved through ecclesiastical authority, and at the top stood the Pope. As long as appeal to Rome remained open, Henry's case could escape English control. Catherine understood that. Her defenders understood it. Rome was the jurisdiction that could say no to the King of England. Before Catherine could be legally displaced, that road had to be blocked. In 1533, the first cut fell not on Catherine's body, but on her route of appeal. Parliament passed the Act in Restraint of Appeals. The title sounds like archive dust. The effect was a constitutional rupture. It declared England an empire, governed by one supreme head and king, and said major legal cases should end inside the king's realm. In practice, it cut Catherine off from Rome. If she could not appeal to the Pope, the decision over her marriage could be made by English church authorities under Henry's pressure. That same year, Thomas Cranmer, recently made Archbishop of Canterbury, convened an ecclesiastical court and pronounced Henry's marriage to Catherine invalid. Anne Boleyn was already pregnant. The legal process was already racing ahead of any public reckoning. Catherine never accepted the ruling. She continued to regard herself as Henry's lawful wife and England's true queen. But law changes what institutions are allowed to recognize. On paper, Catherine became Princess Dowager, the title attached to her earlier marriage to Henry's brother Arthur. Mary's position grew precarious. Catherine's household was diminished, her movements and visitors restricted. She was not dragged to a scaffold, but she was separated from the public identity that had defined her for more than 20 years. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy completed the rerouting. Henry was recognized as supreme head of the Church of England. The Pope was no longer the final court above the king. The king became the highest authority inside his own church. Catherine's fall shows the machine at its first setting. It could erase a queen without killing her. It could turn a marriage dispute into a constitutional revolution. Once judgment moved from Rome to London, the question was how far the machinery could go. When that machinery turned toward Anne Boleyn, it no longer stopped at erasing a queen's title. It found a way to turn a wife into a traitor. Anne had been the reason Henry broke with Rome, the woman whose marriage helped create the new English church. By 1536, she had not produced a surviving son. Henry's attention had shifted, and her political alliances were weakening. In that atmosphere, accusation became sharper than annulment. The charges were framed as high treason, not private scandal. Anne was accused of adultery with several men, including her own brother, and of conspiring against the king's life. These allegations are deeply disputed, and many historians regard them as politically driven, implausible, or fabricated. What matters is what the legal system did next. Under Tudor logic, the king's body was tied to the realm, the succession, and the future of government. If the queen had allegedly betrayed Henry sexually, royal paternity could be questioned. If succession could be questioned, the kingdom could be threatened. If the king's death was imagined or discussed, treason could close around the marriage bed. That was the lethal turn. An alleged betrayal inside a marriage could be prosecuted as betrayal of the state. There was a formal process. Men accused alongside her were tried first. Confessions and testimony were gathered under conditions we should not mistake for modern fairness. Anne was tried in the Tower before a court of peers, with the Duke of Norfolk presiding. The ritual of judgment was there: charges, proceedings, verdict, sentence. But formality did not make it neutral. It unfolded inside faction, fear, and the king's urgent need for release. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was convicted of treason and executed. Not because the allegations have been proven beyond doubt to history, but because institutions accepted the conversion: allegation into treason, treason into conviction, conviction into authorized death. Catherine of Aragon showed the machine could strip a queen of recognition. Anne Boleyn showed it could send one from a marriage contract to the Tower, but not every wife would meet the same ending. Then the pattern breaks. She was not brought down by trial, annulment, or treason. In 1537, she gave Henry what his first two marriages had not produced: a legitimate son, Edward, the child around whom the Tudor future could be reorganized. For the court, the family tree finally had the male branch Henry had been trying to secure for nearly 3 decades. Jane's status, briefly, was strengthened by childbirth rather than threatened by law. Then she died shortly afterward. Her death belongs to the dangers of childbirth in the 16th century, not to the legal attacks used against Catherine of Aragon or Anne Boleyn. But it reveals the same pressure system from another angle. A queen could be safest politically at the moment her body was under the greatest dynastic demand. Jane did not need to be erased from the marriage, because she had fulfilled its central political purpose. Anne of Cleves shows the quieter setting. Her marriage to Henry in 1540 was a diplomatic arrangement tied to Protestant alliances on the continent and to Thomas Cromwell's calculations. When that alliance became less useful, and when Henry wanted out, the solution was not the Tower, it was the annulment file. The marriage was annulled on legal and canonical grounds, including claims that it had not been consummated and that Anne had previously been contracted to Francis of Lorraine. Those arguments gave the separation a lawful shape. They could make a queen into someone who, legally, had never fully been a wife. Anne accepted the settlement and was recast as the king's beloved sister, with property and rank but without the crown. This was not execution, and should not be treated as equivalent to execution. It was status removal without bloodshed, a diplomatic marriage dissolved, a woman's public identity rewritten by legal formula. By Henry's fifth marriage, the pattern was clearer. It could produce an heir, dissolve an alliance, manage legitimacy, and avoid killing when killing was unnecessary. The next case showed a darker possibility. Parliament could turn accusation into death without the ordinary protections of a trial. After Anne of Cleves, the paperwork turned back toward the Tower. Catherine Howard entered marriage as a young queen in a court already trained to turn intimacy into state danger. When allegations emerged about her past and her conduct after marriage, the issue was not treated as private disgrace. It became a problem for the crown, the succession, and the king's public authority. This time, the route to death did not depend on the kind of ordinary trial Anne Boleyn had faced. Catherine Howard was condemned through a bill of attainder. In practical terms, an attainder let Parliament become court and weapon at once. A person could be named in a bill, declared guilty of treason or another grave offence, stripped of legal protection, property, rank, and life. Then the bill could become law once it passed Parliament and received royal assent. No jury had to hear a full defence in the ordinary way. No open courtroom had to test every accusation before sentence. Legal judgment could be written into the statute itself. That is the cold escalation in Catherine Howard's case. The process itself was being redesigned. The machine was not only applying existing rules to a queen, it was reshaping rules around Henry's humiliation. Parliament passed legislation that treated a woman's concealed sexual history before marriage to the king as treasonous, because it could be framed as fraud against the monarch and a threat to the purity of the royal succession. The law reached backward. Catherine's alleged past became material for a new category of royal danger. Once the bill moved, the path was clear. Accusation, council inquiry, parliamentary act, royal assent, Tower. The terror is not that law disappeared, it remained visible at every step. Seal, statute, and formal language gave state violence the shape of procedure. When Catherine Howard was executed in 1542, it proved that by the middle of Henry's reign, even the past could be made punishable if Parliament and Crown wrote the punishment into law. The shadow of the Tower did not end with Catherine Howard. Henry's last wife lived close enough to see it reach her own door. Catherine Parr is remembered as the survivor, the steady queen who outlasted the king. But survival was not the same as safety. By the 1540s, religion had become one of the most dangerous languages at court. Parr was drawn to reformist ideas, while conservative figures around Henry looked for vulnerability. Her danger did not come from adultery or succession scandal. It came from books, sermons, argument, and theology. The possibility that religious discussion by a queen could be recast as heresy. The details come through later accounts and court tradition, so the warrant itself should be treated carefully. But the core story is clear enough. In 1546, accusations gathered around Parr, and an arrest warrant was reportedly prepared with Henry's approval. The machinery had not vanished. It had changed its charge from treason to heresy. Parr's response was calculation, not defiance. She went to Henry and presented her religious discussions as submission, a way to learn from his superior judgment, distract him from pain, and draw wisdom from the king himself. It handed Henry the role he wanted: teacher, judge, and supreme authority. When officials later came expecting to move against her, Henry turned on them instead. Parr had read the system in time: accusation, factional pressure, wounded supremacy, and the legal route that could have carried her away. Her survival proves the final bitter point. Under Henry, a queen did not have to be guilty to be endangered. She had to understand quickly enough which law was being sharpened against her. Pull back from the portraits, and the pattern sharpens. Not 6 identical victims, not one method repeated 6 times. It is a system learning how to make royal desire look like public order. Catherine of Aragon was not killed. She was displaced by a church-state revolution that cut away her appeal to Rome and renamed her place in the world. Anne Boleyn was destroyed through a treason trial, where disputed allegations became an imagined wound against king and succession. Jane Seymour was not prosecuted, but her short life shows the demand at the center of the machine, an heir strong enough to stabilize the dynasty. Anne of Cleves survived because annulment solved a political problem without blood. Catherine Howard was condemned by attainder, with Parliament helping turn accusation into punishment without an ordinary trial. Catherine Parr survived because she saw, just in time, how heresy could become another legal door to the Tower. The paper trail is real. Acts, trials, annulments, warrants, parliamentary procedures, seals in red wax. Historians still argue over motives, factions, timing, and how much of each charge was invention, exaggeration, or belief. But the larger lesson does not require flattening the cases into one story. Henry's reign is frightening because violence did not always arrive as a naked command. It arrived in procedure. It passed through councils, courts, bishops, statutes, signatures, and parliament. That is the final shape of Henry's marital terror, not lawless, legalized.